Hi, this is Ren,
This is KC,
and this is All Walks of Film.
or Drunk Walks of Film.
Yeah, because I'm totally buzzed right now.
You're buzzed, I'm good. But I had significantly less.
Yeah. So we just got done watching Bright, one of the most critically panned movies of 2017.
In the year that the Emoji Movie came out. And no, I'm never gonna see that.
Yeah. So, if you're going to donate to our Patreon, we're just not going to see that movie. We're not going to cover it.
We already saw Patrick Stewart call himself a piece of poo. I mean, if you've already seen that, why are you gonna watch the Emoji Movie?
Yeah.
That's not a good reason to see any movie, but if you've already seen that, then...
I will do anything for subs, but I won't do that.
Yes!
So, given that, I went in with astronomically low expectations. I was not looking forward to watching this movie.
Actually, what are you talking about? You recommended that we watch it like 10 different times as a movie to laugh at.
Well, yeah.
The Room.
Well, I didn't know, what level of bad the movie was going to be. So, I wasn't sure if I was going to watch it and then be like, oh, well, this is a movie to nitpick and all that kind of stuff. Which, to be fair, this is a movie that you can certainly nitpick.
Oh, it's hardly perfect by any means.
Right. But I think probably the most shocking thing was I was expecting a movie much, much, much worse than what we got.
Well, yeah, because I actually do like Max Landis and his style, and I've heard probably a couple dozen of his movie pitches, every single one of which I've loved. And I saw Chronicle. I think that's the only movie I've actually seen that he wrote that was made. But even though, I like Max Landis, the whole thing of, it's a buddy cop film, but one of them's an orc. I was just like, oh dear God, kill me. Nope. Done. Not interested. And then we have to address the whole controversy of the movie. The rightful controversy of the movie, I should say. There's a lot of controversies about the movie. But, obviously, in a movie like this, one of the things is this was one of the only movies to be looked at for a nomination for Best Hair and Makeup by the Oscars. Keep in mind, Shape of Water didn't make the list. Bright made the list. Not fair. But, more importantly, they had hired an effects makeup studio to do the makeup work for the movie, and it was a team of some 60 people. And none of them were credited. And there's no excuse for that.
Yeah.
Even the company, when they had to come out with it publicly, they're like, okay, we understand, big movies, lots of crew members, maybe you miss one or two, sometimes mistakes happen, but you specifically did not credit anyone who worked on the special effects makeup for this movie. That is not okay. That is completely unacceptable. Especially because, let's face it, most people work for very little. And probably not nearly enough. A lot of times people have to deal with the fact that they're being paid late. They work 12 hours a day minimum, 6 days a week minimum. And then to not even be credited, it's so fucked up. I don't know if that situation has been resolved or not, but it's got to be thrown out there, especially because the makeup is really good in the movie.
Yeah.
It's really, I mean, I don't care how shitty the makeup is. If you showed up and you were there and you did the work.
Yeah, and we certainly do need to address that there have been sexual assault allegations against the writer of this film, Max Landis, which it's one of those cases where while certain people I want to believe, and I want to believe people in these situations, but this is definitely one, at least for me, that I would like to have more evidence to. It seems rather vague, and I usually believe stories that have some time and a lot more evidence to back it up. A lot of this seems to be hearsay, which is not to say that these stories aren't true. And if it is true, I will be seriously upset with Max Landis because he was somebody who I liked, and that would suck. But, this is a day and age where
it could be Louis C.K. It could be Aziz Ansari. within the past 5 months.
Yeah, so
It could be Max Landis. It can be Melanie Martinez. It can be literally anybody.
Yeah, I mean, of course, that's probably the next thing that's going to come out. I guarantee that I don't want to make this a whole thing about gender, but I guarantee this whole gendered thing where it's pretty much slanted at the behavior of men is going to come back and bite hard with a couple celebrities that are women, probably doing other... Well, yeah, but...
I mean, I firmly believe every woman who helped Harvey Weinstein needs to be held to the exact same standards.
Right, and Rose McGowan spoke out about that.
A lot of people have spoken out about it, but there hasn't been any real-life repercussions that I've seen so far. That might not be true, but from what I've seen...
Well, I especially think that the women who were kind of escorting these women to Harvey Weinstein should be held accountable as accomplices.
Yes, exactly. They need to be fired. They need to not work in the industry again. And in a court of law, need to be held to the same standards as aiding and abetting.
Exactly. But that being said, let's
actually talk about the movie.
Right.
Because I've gone on a dark tangent that you can't help but go down when you talk about anything in the industry anymore.
Right. And the fact that we are talking about a Max Landis film, we kind of had to, yeah.
But that being said, there were other controversies about this movie. Like, this movie is racist. Number one thing I heard. And I was completely prepared to believe that.
Yeah, I mean, this movie is about racism, but, like, to say that this movie is racist would stand to have more context in the movie to actually make that claim. And I think just having a parallel with the whole fairy lives don't matter isn't, like, necessarily... I mean, yeah, that's addressing...
You have to put that in context, though.
Right.
And for me... personally, this was actually a really nuanced look at racism that I don't normally see in movies, albeit a very imperfect look at racism. This is not the best movie to examine racism through, because, more than anything else, this is a movie critiquing the racist tropes of the fantasy genre, not really taking a very serious look at real-world racism.
Right, and if you want to send the movie for that, I completely understand. But, you know, as far as the fantasy genre goes, one of my biggest complaints with The Lord of the Rings, and, oh, heaven forbid, but, you know, one of my biggest complaints about The Lord of the Rings and, like, countless other, like, fantasy, including sci-fi movies, is this concept of evil races. Like, you know, that these individuals within a race do not have their own agency, and, you know, you just kind of wipe them out and you don't really think about it. You know, I mean, obviously the most glaring one is Lord of the Rings, which this is obviously paralleling with the orcs, you know.
And the elves.
Well, you know, the elves aren't being killed without anybody caring about them in the Lord of the Rings.
But there is an elf town.
Right.
And the elves in this movie are very, very obviously J.R.R. Tolkien's elves.
Right.
Where they're all white and beautiful and rich and successful and intelligent and magically preordained at birth. They just automatically have a much better place in society because of the traits that they were born with. I mean, they are white privilege, the race. In a way that fits very neatly into J.R.R. Tolkien's mythos.
Right, and a lot of elements of the elves were based on Aryan like myths and stuff like that. And that is not to draw complete parallels with, you know, Aryan Nation and all the stuff with, like, Nazis. Exactly. But, you know, that is a thing. Like, the Nazis adapted that, but there is, like, a history with, you know, Aryans and all that kind of stuff that isn't necessarily related to Nazism. That
what I did like about this movie was that it was taking the exact, like, cut, copy, paste tropes of the fantasy genre and putting them into a more relatable context to highlight how racist they actually are, because I feel like a lot of people give it a pass because it's put in a different land, in a different place, in a different thing that's like outside of our society.
Mm.
And by putting the exact racist problems with these tropes in our environment, in our world, that it was really highlighting that, seeing these things in media does affect how we view people. It does have a very real world implication, even though we look at things like that, we're like, oh, it's just fantasy. That doesn't relate to us. But there's not really a difference between the different, species classes in those movies and then in Bright.
Well, and there's also the whole concept of people not wanting things to be politicized and saying, like, oh, I want my movies separate from reality. And it's like, well, entertainment is a reflection of reality. So,
and this was just taking it and highlighting that and making it really obvious.
Right. And while it is in no way perfect in its portrayal, there are a lot of missteps and just kind of shorthanded basic things that the movie does. Like, I don't feel that this movie deserves the type of hatred that it's getting just because, like, it's trying to be different, which I know that sounds kind of weird, but like, we oftentimes, especially like with the movie Mother, we get movies that attempt to be different, and people's automatic take from that is to just reject it because it's like, oh, well, I have a certain worldview, and anything that sort of, goes outside of that, or anything that tries to address something completely obviously, I'm just going to be abject to it because I want to think about something, which, I do think that this movie has certain things to think about. Granted, its plot is pretty basic.
Well, I feel like this is a movie that's really not about the worst thing is the plot.
Right.
Well, probably the third worst thing is the plot. But the plot is not really the point of watching the movie.
Right. What I will say is the two characters, Will Smith and Joel Edgerton, were...
Ward and Nick.
Yeah.
The character names.
Were... I really liked their chemistry that they had together.
I did too, and I think it's actually one of Will Smith's best performances of late. He had a couple of decent lines in Suicide Squad that I attribute solely to him and not to the script.
Yeah, and speaking of Suicide Squad, this is directed by Suicide Squad director David Ayer, which I would say is far superior in almost every way, shape, and form than that movie.
Pretty much in every way, shape, and form except for the soundtrack. And I'm not really a big fan of the Suicide Squad soundtrack, but, I mean, the music in this movie is not that really, period. I wasn't going to go anywhere with that, it's just not really. But that said, it is kind of a really nuanced look at race that we don't get in a lot of movies. Like, a lot more than I was expecting, because with the setup of, oh, we're going to take, these fantasy tropes and turn them on their head by putting them in a modern context, that feels like a great idea for a 20-25-minute short film or TV episode. Not really enough to carry a feature film. But it actually did take it in ways I wasn't expecting. It's really trying to highlight the difference between race and culture in a very interesting way. You don't actually see a lot of stories about, like, being isolated from your own race because of your upbringing, and then being hated by people who look like you and sound like you. And there is a really interesting way where it's also trying to say, like, we shouldn't be divided by our races, and we shouldn't look at each other poorly for our race. Obviously, racism is bad, y'all, okay? But it's also trying to say, like, we should celebrate where we come from and celebrate our heritage and celebrate our culture. Let's not be divided by these things, but also let's not just ignore them. So often, the antithesis of racism is being, quote-unquote, colorblind, which is definitely a problematic issue all in and of itself. Totally. So the movie is really trying to be that in-between, and that's not going to be perfect. at all. It's going to have a lot of missteps. But I did really appreciate that the movie was trying to go there. We shouldn't be segregated into different towns, obviously. They did have this sort of very 50s look at, no orcs allowed and elf town and all this stuff. And that was really on the nose. But then it's also trying to say, like, we should all work together and appreciate each other and not look down at each other for our race. But that doesn't mean we need to just ignore that.
Yeah.
I think that sentiment is a really good idea. And I do think we need to address this thing of, like, just because you're talking about racism doesn't mean... Just because a movie is talking about racism doesn't mean that it's a racist film. Because that came up with 3 Billboards. Like, Sam Rockwell is a very fucked up, problematic character. Who's racist and sexist and all sorts, and homophobic and all sorts of things. But that doesn't mean the whole film is just because they don't paint him as a 2-dimensional evil villain.
Also, I will say, while there were elements that I enjoyed about this movie, this is nowhere near in the same ballpark as 3 Billboards.
Oh, no. I'm just trying to say, like, this is kind of an issue we have of, like, as soon as we see a movie try to address... What I'm saying is, like, there are lines from the script that you could grab to paint the movie as racist. Like, fairy lives don't matter today. Mexicans still get blamed for the Alamo, things like that. But they're trying to highlight racism. They're not trying to say racism is good.
Right, and...
Even though Will Smith is the one who said fairy lives don't matter today, it's specifically trying to point out that everybody has their own racist prejudices, no matter how much you identify with them or even how much they're a good person. Will Smith's character was really interesting because he would say very politically correct things, like he would tell his daughter, don't look down on my partner because he's an orc. Orcs aren't necessarily dumb, but he was definitely very racist against his orcish partner.
Yeah. And
that's a really nuanced look that you don't get in a lot of movies.
Right. And, I know some people's holdbacks from that is the fact that you made this story about these concepts and had the main character be black. I get people's hangups on that. I think it provides a little bit more, like you were saying, nuance, because it allows people to not only see this as like a black and white issue, because so many movies in talking about racism, talk about everything from, as if the United States were only a white and black issue, which it's clearly a lot more than that.
Which is something nice we saw in the casting for this movie, too. For
right.
once.
Yeah, surprisingly, this movie has the most diverse cast out of pretty much every movie we saw in 2017.
Except for maybe Spider-Man Homecoming.
Yeah, which is pretty crazy, especially since, like, this is a Netflix movie that, while a handful of people saw it, nobody saw it in theaters.
Well, yeah.
Which, I do want to commend the movie for doing that because, honestly, I feel that film should reflect the society that we live in. And, especially if you live in the city, you're going to have more than just like a black and white issue. Like, yes, that was important, that still is important. But, there are more issues, as far as like race goes, Latinos, Native Americans, all this kind of stuff. And oftentimes,
people
yeah,
from Southeast Asia.
Right. And oftentimes they get thrown to the wayside, and everything gets turned into a black and white issue.
Right. We do live in a country where this is not to say we shouldn't be talking about things like...
No, we absolutely do need to be talking about those.
We're still talking about, slavery. Absolutely. I'm not saying we need to talk any less about that by any means. But we don't talk about,
what, wage slavery?
Manifest Destiny. We don't talk about that nearly as much, which is kind of insane to me because the Native Americans, we literally live all over their fucking land. It's so bullshit.
Yeah.
But this is also the same country that had internment camps about 100 years ago. That's insane, and that's something like people just don't talk about very much, which is insane to me. All I'm saying is that America is a country that's built on being racist and asshole to pretty much every kind of person.
Yeah, including...
And all of those things should be discussed. Every single one of those things should be discussed in the mainstream, consciousness.
Yeah, including certain white peoples, like Italians.
Irish people, yeah, exactly.
Polish people, yeah.
Well, to go off on a slight tangent, that was something that Americans really ignored about a lot of racist Brexit issues was a lot of really racist attacks were aimed at Polish people.
Interesting.
Which is really fucked. I mean, any kind of racist attack is fucked up, but that's something in America we just sort of ignored.
Well, because at least in the United States, a lot of racism is based on color. The most apparent differences.
Well, that was, going back to Bright, that's something that's really interesting about the movie, is the movie doesn't completely ignore the fact that humans are still racist towards one another, even in the society, but it's more trying to highlight the fact that even if we could magically somehow, humans are not racist towards each other. We're going to find a way to be a shitty, prejudiced asshole towards other people like us for stupid reasons over things that happened 2,000 years ago.
Well, yeah,
instead of trying to reach like a deeper understanding, and it's trying to point out how fucked up that is. I think that's more important than just taking a couple lines out of context.
Well, yeah, and before cultures were blended together, anybody from any other land was seen as the other and looked down upon. It didn't matter what the color of their skin was. If they were from a different region, no. And while we move towards colorism later on, and I'm sure that did exist. There is a little bit of nuance in history where you have dark Greek leaders and kings. So, it seems that, colorism happened much later in history. Like, I would say circa the 1500s. We're always
going to find a stupid reason.
Right, exactly.
And that's another thing in Bright that I think is interesting, is you can dissect it as being about racism, and you can dissect it about being about classism in pretty much equal measure, which I think is fantastic. We have this whole dialogue, in the public consciousness about intersectionality. And that's what Bright is entirely about, is about intersectionality. And people just want to bash it because, honestly, I don't really know why. I mean, it's not perfect.
Yeah.
But I do feel like the movie is trying to be exactly what it wants to be, so I can't hate it too much.
All right, so I will say some of the problems that I had was, the fact that the female characters in the movie were significantly sidelined, which is a problem.
Not all of them, pretty much just Tika.
Yeah, but
Cho's character was exactly what it should have been.
Right, but when you're talking about a prominent character in the film, the fact that she's sidelined is a problem.
She's not even sidelined, though. The problem is that she's not a character. She's literally a human plot device.
Right.
Like, she doesn't do anything. She has no personality. I mean, as much as Max Landis wants to bitch and whine about Mary Sue's, she's not even a Mary Sue. She's literally a physical plot.
Yeah, so, that was an issue. Also, like, Noomi Rapace could have had, like, a little bit more character development to her.
Other than just the what the twist moment towards the end of the movie that nobody cared about.
Yeah.
She's a sister! Nobody cares. That's a problem, but I do think the worst problem with the movie is the way it handles the copper issue. And by that I mean that it doesn't handle it at all, and that's bullshit. The two main characters are cops, and they're good guy cops, in very loose, sarcastic air quotes, because all throughout the movie, they're shooting people up, and blowing shit up, and being total shitheads, and not taking their duty seriously as police officers. And then at the end of the movie, they're being rewarded for all their bullshit, and the audience is supposed to feel good about that. And that's crap.
Yeah, I mean, there was that moment where Nick let that one guy off because all he was doing was graffitiing.
Yeah.
And
there is the whole thing where Will Smith's daughter is like, everybody hates police officers. Why do you have to be a police officer? And then the movie conveniently forgets that he has a wife and kid for about half the movie when he's talking about how much he doesn't give a shit about his own life and he'll just die right then and there for no reason. I have to repeat this line because it's so great. Let's get titty bar gunfight die right now. Fucking yes! I love that line.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so we'll be perfectly honest. This is like one of those this is one of those movies where, like, there's sort of an enjoyment with how kind of bad it is, but also, like, I do think that the film has genuine moments that I liked. Like, I like the interaction between Nick and Ward. I seriously didn't have like a huge issue. I did think it was kind of funny that one of the characters in the movie was named George Miller.
Yeah.
Just because, like,
we know you're thinking about Electric Sheep.
Oh,
episode 1.
Derp.
But speaking of Electric Sheep, I do want to point out a small thing about Bright is it had the best callback to Blade Runner I've seen in all of 2017, including the Blade Runner sequel and one episode of the TV show based on the writings of the guy who did the book that inspired Blade Runner. In the whole, like, you see this futuristic world with just, like, this little explosion in the middle of the city, and I was just like, that's how you do Blade Runner citation, damn it!
Yeah, that was pretty cool. I also think, like, a lot of elements of the world building were interesting. I liked how it was sort of a blend between, like, this old school magic and, kind of like this gritty modern LA.
Mm-hmm. Or Chicago, or
wherever,
whatever, yeah.
It's not really
heavily metropolitan area with a high crime rate.
Yeah, you take your pick.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just thought
it's like Neo Metropolis, essentially.
Yeah. I thought combining, the socioeconomic struggles and paralleling it with what's going on in our world with this whole fantasy world, I thought was interesting. Granted, it's not perfect. It's not subtle, which apparently people were expecting for this movie, which I'm just like, why were you expecting a subtle movie when it's literally about magical creatures living in the United States? I mean, granted, if you want something that's a little bit more nuanced than this film, I would strongly recommend you check out the comic series Fable. There's also a video game based on that world, which is called The Wolf Among Us. So if that sort of thing interests you, there is an outlet for that. I am not a fan of the ABC show. What is that show called? The one where it's like the fantasy characters from Disney movies.
Oh, Once Upon a Time?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I feel this good. I mean, if you want to see, like, a much more nuanced take on, problems with institutional racism in today's society, watch Get Out.
Yeah, or...
I'm sorry, but just no duh.
Or watch Zootopia.
Yeah. With that said, I feel like Bright was exactly what he wanted to be. You can't be that mad at Sharknado for being exactly the movie it's trying to be.
Yeah, like, it's not trying to be this highbrow movie, which, based on, like, all the comments and stuff that I'm reading, it's like, people were, like, expecting this movie to be, like, what?
I do get it.
Or were they just trying to shit on Max Landis and David Ayer before even watching the movie? Because I understand, like...
I think that a lot of people were shitting on it for its reputation, but I think that people were thinking that it's a movie talking in any way, shape, or form about racism and police brutality, therefore it should be taken seriously. But on that note, I would be like, we went through 5 years of Key and Peele and never expected them to be like really serious about it. Although, let's be completely honest for a second, they're far more sophisticated than this movie is. But it's not like it's always treated seriously.
And I think, just to speak, talking about that, I think that part of it is the fact that, Jordan Peele and Keegan-Michael Key are African American, and a lot of these people
mix, but I mean, yes, exactly.
Right, but then you have this film where the two creative minds behind it are white, and then people have issues with it.
Right, and in all honesty, I'm Euro-mutt, and you're, part white, part Puerto Rican. So, I mean, I most definitely at certain points have put my foot in my mouth, and please call me out on that, because, yeah, I'm sure I did.
Well, yeah, and, I grew up in a very mixed neighborhood, predominantly African American, I certainly am not the most culturally sensitive all the time. I make mistakes, and I have had prejudice about things. I always try to be the best person that I can be, but we all have prejudice, and it all comes out sometimes.
But all of that being said, my point at the end of all of this is that I'm giving this a not that bad,
right?
Not a amazing must-see film of 2017, top 10, highbrow, nothing like that. It's a not that bad.
Right. It's
the year that Ghost in the Shell came out. This is the year that Death Note came out.
Oh my god, Death Note is the worst movie of the year. Sorry, exactly. That's a spoiler for like our award show, but like Jesus Christ.
No, it's not. We've both said multiple times it's the worst thing that we saw this year. It's not as bad as Wonder Model or Justice League, and it's not nearly as culturally insensitive or fucked up as Wind fucking River. So, like, it's a not that bad movie. I'm not gonna, this is not the hill I want to die defending by any means.
Yeah. All right, so let us know what you thought of Bright. Let us know in the comments below. If you want to support us on Patreon, you can go to our Patreon site. You can also follow us on Facebook, and we're doing a little award show. So if you go onto our Facebook page, you can make some votes for our award show. Thanks for listening.